Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. And today we have a very interesting talk that you would be glad to listen to. And Stephen Friedman is the great philosopher, the New York Times great philosopher, an artist, and also a scientist, a great speaker of ours. And we're really glad to have you all weekly. And also, we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for your questions, your feedback. We truly appreciate it all, and we will definitely address them today. And if you do have any questions or feedback to share, please feel free to do that. We will address them next week. Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaliyah, as always. I also want to thank the Consul General in Almaty. I'd like to thank Elmira, Dana, the entire staff, the team that makes this possible, that provides this platform for weekly philosophical perspectives on a broad range of topics. Today's talk is actually motivated by World Poetry Day, which was March 21st, last week. I write poetry, and my poetry conjoins the philosophical work I do. Some of the poetry runs independently, but much of it intersects the philosophy and helps advance the philosophical goals and the philosophical ideas that I'm interested in communicating. I think that the convergence of poetry and philosophy helps communicate, philosophy more effectively. Philosophy is difficult abstractly. Poetry can provide a more sensory dimension to the experience, to the communication. The title of today's talk is The Poetry of Philosophy. And as if you've been sort of following these talks, I've actually given a talk on the books of Joshua, which is a poetic work, a work of narrative poetry. Tonight I'm going to, or today, I say tonight because again, it's Los Angeles that I'm speaking from, and here it's nighttime. So pardon me if I make that mistake periodically. But I will be reciting some things from Joshua. Some I've recited before, some will be new. I'm also going to recite some other selections of other types of poetry. I've written poetry that some other figures, prominent figures especially, in the American literary tradition and the British literary tradition have written, again, that intersect philosophical issues and concerns. I wanted to begin by playing something. It's actually an excerpt from a work by Handel, and I'll explain why I'm playing this in just a second. Here is the piece. Let me... Okay, the reason I played Handel is he was the composer that Beethoven most admired. The reason that Beethoven admired Handel was, as he put it, Handel was able to achieve the greatest effects with the simplest means. Now, that's actually a goal of philosophy. It's a goal of much human effort, intellectual effort. It's a goal of the sciences, to achieve simple formulations that explain a vast array of phenomena. That was the triumph of Newtonian physics. It's the triumph of relativity in quantum mechanics. It's what I do, what I aim for philosophically when I discuss different philosophical aphorisms, different poetic expressions of the philosophy. I'm partly doing that because they all ultimately relate to some very simple formulations. Now, simple in the sense that once they're explained, they're expressing fundamentally simple ideas. And again, I've referred to this repeatedly. The logic of heuristic, the logic of epistemic rigorous spaces, and the convergence between the two. That explains everything in my talks. But I'm interested in understanding and communicating understanding, and so I'm not going to just present that picture, that representation of the philosophy. I'm going to refer to aphorisms. As I've mentioned in the past, I've written about 20,000 aphorisms now, and each one is addressing the philosophy from a slightly different direction. But if you understand one aphorism well, you basically understand the core of the philosophical perspective that I'm developing and communicating. There was a story comes to mind, actually, in relation to this. I was doing this play, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, in New York a few years ago. And the director at some point, I think trying to help motivate my performance, because I'm not an actor, not a performer, and this was the first time I was ever on a stage, and I was on a stage in New York City. So it was a challenging experience, and I was doing a one-person show that went on for an hour and a half. So again, challenging. But he says to me, because at some point he came to understand the nature of the philosophy within the play. And he said, Stephen, it's really quite extraordinary that you're able to achieve all of these results, all of these applications from a very simple core of philosophical representation. Things such as, within the play, I emphasize the past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Two is not one. And it turns out that those aphorisms about the nature of time ultimately are explained and contained within the even simpler proposition, 2 is not equal to 1. I once did skywriting Eden, 2 not equal to 1, to communicate, again, that degree of simplified representation that everything else can be related to. And he said to me, the fact that everything relates to something so simple but so concentrated is messianic. That was his term. Well, I'm glad he was enthusiastic about it in that way, but that is part of the essence and the power, of what I'm undertaking to explain. That if the philosophy had not been distilled, were not simplified down to a point where a few, again, elemental representations can capture the whole, again, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be doing these talks. So, now, the reason I mention Handel and played Handel, and the reason I bring up Beethoven, I mention Handel because of Beethoven's comment about him, which also says something about the nature of philosophy itself. Beethoven also made a comment, a famous remark, about philosophy in relation to music. Beethoven said, music is a higher revelation, a deeper revelation, a greater revelation than all of wisdom and philosophy. Now, obviously, Beethoven was a composer, and so Beethoven's strength and commitment, engagement was to music, and he developed, powers of musical expression that were unprecedented to that point. So I acknowledge, his commitment to what music is able to communicate, and how music is able to transform our relationship to the world. But Beethoven, was writing, creating 200 years ago, and philosophy has advanced since then. I've emphasized that I haven't really encountered philosophers historically or contemporary philosophers who see philosophy quite as I do, as the limit of rigor. And for me, that's its ultimate power. That's its ultimate claim to our attention. And not to recognize that, not to embrace that, is to fail to see what philosophy's potential and what it brings to us, and what it brings to us in every direction. And when I did cancer work some years ago, it was an application of that philosophical understanding. When when I when I do these weekly talks, I see philosophy and I'm trying to communicate that philosophy is at the limit of rigor because it does represent rigorous representation and is the only dimension of human intellectual enterprise that does. It's the strongest thing there is. It's the strongest possible thing, which means it's the most secure. It is the safest of all places to be within that philosophical domain, that domain of an incontrovertible rigor. That's its power. So again, Beethoven, was not privy or was not seeing philosophy in that way because philosophy at that time was not quite being seen in that way. It's taken a lot of intellectual development, a lot of work by mathematical logicians, by Frege, by Russell, by Wittgenstein, by Gödel, by others, to develop the concept of rigor and bring me to this representation of the subject. Now, one of the things interesting, I know I'm kind of talking around the issue of poetry, but I will get to it. I've talked before about the Delphic Oracle, about its admonition, know thyself, right, which is one of the most famous admonitions in the history of Western philosophy, world philosophy. Well, it applies to all of us. I've given talks on on the nature of self-knowledge, but it also applies to philosophy. That one of the things that is central to the philosophical enterprise is to come to a clear understanding of what philosophy is. That is germane to every philosopher's work. And every major philosopher has affected, has altered, has enriched our understanding of the nature of philosophy itself. So, we've gone beyond, philosophies, how philosophy was thought of in Beethoven's time. But in addition, in my philosophical work, I am adding poetic elements because I recognize the power of music, the power of sound. And as I'm going to discuss very shortly, when you cohere, when you converge philosophical ideas with musical representation, poetic representation, because as we'll see, the essence of poetry, at least as I practice it, as I write it, is sound, music, rhythm, the music of the language. So I am using the music of language to help communicate the emotionality of the ideas that are otherwise being conveyed, abstract ideas often being conveyed within the words themselves. So there is the conceptualization, like in my aphorisms, but there is also the sound that helps communicate the meaning and the force and the comfort, the profound comfort that these ideas are expressing and are communicating and are achieving. that rigor and rigor alone is able to accomplish. So, what I thought I would do, I referenced the books of Joshua at the beginning to give us, again, a sense of the music of the language that I'm talking about. I'll recite a little bit of the books of Joshua. This is early on. This is really about, remember, books of Joshua is an autobiographical philosophical narrative. It deals with the development of my philosophical ideas in the context of life experiences that helped motivate them. So these early sections are quasi-philosophical, right? They are, but they are addressing the philosophical ambition. So let me recite a little. And again, it's the sound as much as the ideas that matter. So when we're talking about poetry, ultimately we're talking about the sound of the formulation, of the communication. Onward now we go, to study what we think we know, compared to what is truly so. Okay. I've distracted myself, and I want to make sure I get this right. So let me go back here. Fortunately, I wrote this down. Okay. Onward now we go, to study what we think we know, compared to what is truly so. A process Socrates began, to die the model of a man over 2 millennia ago. The time had come to read the sum of Western philosophic thought, to discover what had been tried and taught, from Plato to Aquinas to Descartes to Hume, Kant and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein to consume, and everyone in between, before and after, were the authors I tried to master, as deities start counting tears in the early teenage years. From west, he traveled. Joshua is my alter ego. That I was reciting was something that I transcribed into Phalaris's bull. So sometimes when I recite it, I say I, but in the books of Joshua, it's he, Joshua. So I'll revert to Joshua. From west, he traveled east, to weigh the words that had released ascetics from a wheel of fire. And then a girl from Oz appeared and waved her magic wand, a second muse to guide him to enchantment and beyond. She taught him how to read the patterns in a rippled pond, as at the moment of creation and every moment on. Under her spell, he learned to dwell in rhythm and in rhyme, and to assess each pregnant stress in the silences of time. Induction became a recurring concern, how we can know the future, how we can ever learn, and how we can escape the imaginings of fate. What we know and what to sow, what we can assume, and every mode of exit from a cloistered room, the tragic vision of the world and certainty of doom, and the climate and the soil that Eden needs to bloom. These obsessions form processions of symbols in the mind, abstractions of subtractions, detailed and refined, an answer to a dancer, choreographed to a will resigned, but seeking a solution in symbols of another kind. Something he could not be sure that he would ever find. So, the music there, the music of the poetry, is as important as the ideas. And that remains so throughout all of my writings. Poetry is a matter of sound, more fundamentally for me and many other poets than it is imagery. Even a poet of the magnitude of Shakespeare who is celebrated for the imagery of his writing, the visual sort of ideas that he suggests, is primarily a poet of sound and of rhythm and of cadence. Here, let me, to illustrate that, here's a little passage from Othello towards the end of the play, the Tragedy of Othello. My mother had a maid called Barbary. He she loved proved mad, and did forsake her. She had a song a willow. An old thing 'twas, but it expressed her fortune, and she died singing it. That song tonight will not go from my mind. I have much to do, but go hang my head all at one side, and sing it like poor Barbary. That's one of the famous passages in Shakespeare, one of the most moving passages in Shakespeare. And it's not a passage of imagery, primarily. It's a passage of sound. There's a contemporary American poet, Amanda Gorman, who is our poet laureate, our national poet. At a young age, I think she's the youngest poet laureate in this country's history. She delivered a poem at the previous President Biden's inauguration a few years ago, a little over a year ago. And afterwards, she was interviewed. That was the first time I had heard of her or heard her work. I think that was true for many people. But she became immediately renowned, celebrated, from having delivered this moving poem on such an occasion with such a platform. So she was interviewed. She gave a number of interviews after that, and she was talking about her poetic practice. And she said that for her, poetry is a matter of sound. Me too. Not imagery, sound, rhythm, cadence, as I said. And it's something that infuses all of my philosophical writings. It infuses the books of Joshua conspicuously, but it also infuses the aphorisms. Sometimes there's a rhyming element, but not necessarily, but there is always an attention to the sound of the construction that helps convey the emotion of the thought itself. I was once explaining some of the philosophy to a student of mine, a young student, a girl who was a teenager, but from a Jewish background. Her family was Orthodox Jewish. And I was illustrating some of my writings to emphasize the power that philosophical rigor is able to achieve, a power that rivals any of the expressions that one reads in the religious tradition of writings. And it has a power that represents not just the power of the ideas, but the power of the emotion to comfort, to communicate a sense of this is a definitive solution. This is the strongest. This is the safest place of all. Aphorisms like, existence resolves to salvation. The incontrovertible solves the world. That has an emphatic quality to it that communicates the power of rigor that's embedded within the philosophical ideas, that is embedded within this formulation. And I want to emphasize, if it wasn't for that formulation, if it wasn't for the rigor, that is the foundation for everything I'm developing philosophically, then the poetic expression would just be an emotion. But here it's serving a deeper purpose. It's serving to communicate the feeling of comfort that these ideas are meant to embody and convey. There's another illustration of that. When I first started showing my art, the pole art, at the gallery that represents me in Los Angeles, one of my first major shows, and I've probably mentioned this before, I had the poles configured in the interior of the gallery space. They were actually suspended, from the ceiling in different configurations, different sizes of poles, painted in diverse ways. On the wall were the aphoristic contents of one of my books. I think there were 52 aphorisms. I actually would read some selections from that particular book, but it turns out it's not a book that I have in a file on my computer. It's a book that I have only in a printed form, and that printed form is kind of in a box that with many other sort of manuscripts, and I just wanted to leave it alone. But you've been exposed. I think among the aphorisms was that aphorism, the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. Another one, the Bible is not the word of God. The word of God is stronger. The word of God is the word of rigor. That's how God can be seen as most fully expressed, because that's the most powerful thing of all in human experience. So aphorisms, of that nature. Someone visited the show who I think was from Spain. He spoke English, but it wasn't his native tongue, and he didn't really speak it well. So the aphorisms were challenging, for him to come to terms with in terms of their ideas, right? They're hard enough to understand in English, to an English speaker, again, because philosophy is not the easiest thing to commune with. But, again, my aphorisms are designed so that one or two can sort of strike an individual and provide that individual with understanding without having to read through a thousand pages of discursive philosophical writing. That's a challenge for anyone. But what was interesting is I spoke to him after he had visited the show, and he said to me, he admitted that he couldn't understand the content, the cognitive, the intellectual content, within the aphorisms generally, but he said they communicated. He could sound out the words, he could read the aphorisms, and he said it was clear to him that they communicated through their sound, through their poetry. So he felt their power, and he felt their comforting aspect, and he felt their definitive representation of philosophic truth. So that's, again, now, that's not how, they're meant to communicate more than just in terms of the sound, more than just poetically, but again, the poetic helps serve the end of understanding. Another specific example, in terms of an aphorism. And again, aphorisms are almost meant to function a little bit like Zen koans, where one can communicate. And that's been my experience with them. I never know, again, I've written 20,000. I never know which one or ones might have impact, might achieve understanding, for a given individual. But my sense is that there's one out there, okay? I had a neighbor. I lived in Marina Del Rey, which is actually not far from where I live now in Santa Monica, Los Angeles. I had a neighbor come over one day, and she came onto my front lawn, and I went out, and we started talking, and we were talking. She had been a writer, or she was a writer. And we started talking about, I guess, the aphorisms, the philosophy, because at one point I offered her one. And the aphorism was, blues, greens, aquamarines. Who could have imagined? Now again, it has a poetic form. It has a poetic sound. It rhymes. But aside from the rhyme, again, it has a musical structure that is intentional. Blues, greens, aquamarines. Who could have imagined? Told her the aphorism, and she took it in, and our conversation ended. But the following day, I was out on my front balcony, and I see her across the street, and she's walking towards me, and as she gets closer, she starts running towards my house. So I go onto the front lawn, and she runs into my arms, okay, and embraces me, and she says, "That aphorism you told me yesterday, blues, greens, aquamarines, I can't get it out of my mind. That is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." She understood the philosophy from that aphorism, the idea that that these colors around us, blues, greens, aquamarines, well, one way to say what that aphorism is expressing is those are the colors of Eden. But we don't always appreciate that, see those colors in relation to Eden. We don't see the epistemic space that gives the landscape of Eden. But she got an intimation of that, an understanding of that, a communication of that from those few words. And the poetic expression. And in the case of that, there's some imagery, right? Because I'm talking of colors. So that's another illustration of how the philosophy conjoins with poetic representation and does so conspicuously, intentionally in my work. In fact, my feeling is if you're going to write something, you might as well attend also to the sound, to the poetic elements, to the poetic dimension to help achieve an even more forceful and complete communication. In the history of Western philosophy, poets in general have not numbered among the most celebrated philosophers. They're, when we think of, for example, Socrates, we think of, of a questioning mind, really a logical mind, a very sharp and discerning mind. When we think of Aristotle, we think of a logician. The writings that have come down to us of his are dry. They're like legal writings. They are among the most challenging, I think, of philosophical writings to deal with. In some historical accounts, one reads that they actually were lecture notes, and his more popular representations of his work didn't survive, but it's hard to know for sure. But in any case, what we have of Aristotle is more the work of a logician than of a poet. We don't encounter, for me anyway, poetic expression much in Aristotle. But we do in Plato. And Plato was a poet, wrote poetry. His dialogues have a poetical, dramatic element to them. They often begin with some poetic setting that's highly evocative. I make a reference when I go through a list of the major philosophers, certainly that influenced me in Phalaris's Bull. I reference Plato as Plato who brought a poet's sensibility and vision to the subject. He enhanced philosophy, elevated philosophy, partly by this poetic dimension of representation. Again, central to my work. I actually have been, I think, a little bit more impressed by Aristotle, in my early readings, but there's something in Plato's temperament that might be a little bit closer to how I write and express philosophy. But so even though we don't always associate the poetic at a high level with major philosophical achievement, it was present in the works of one of the greatest of all philosophers and one of the seminal philosophers, Plato. It's a famous remark about Plato's work is that all of philosophy is but a set of footnotes to Plato. But be that as it may, and if that was the case, it ceased being the case with some of the contemporary work in philosophy. For example, with the work of Wittgenstein, who it's been said has had, for his later, more mature philosophical writing, no ancestor in the history of thought. Well, so we see how the poetic expression and poetic aspiration, poetic formulation infuses at least my philosophical work and others. In some instances, though, I have to say, there have been philosophers, I think Emerson and Thoreau are examples, philosophers who, to my mind, to my reading, were taking philosophical ideas and trying to give them a poetic form or formulation. It often has not seemed to be natural, a natural expression, the best expression. In the case of someone like Thoreau, I think his most poetic philosophical expression was achieved when he was actually communicating more directly, philosophically, discursively, rather than when he was trying to write poems. One of the most poetical reaches, of philosophy is the final line of his great work, Walden. The sun is but a morning star. There's a highly charged poetical representation, metaphorical representation of a very important philosophical idea. Basically, past cannot guarantee the future. Anything is still possible. Central to the rigorous representation of the world where 2 points are not one. Any distinction between any 2 points, any 2 circumstances, means that what applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other, and so we are therefore freed from the past and whatever constraints we might intuit of it. Those constraints are presumptions, and those presumptions are the ultimate source of human suffering, the ultimate source of that sense of imprisonment, that tragic sense of life, that a rigorous application of philosophical instrumentation is capable of freeing us from, and is the only thing that is capable of freeing us from all of those presumptions that we're often not even aware of, but that, again, ensnare us. That presumption about the inevitability of death or the nature of death, right? Famously, Socrates resists claims about death, and that is the beginning of his claim to philosophical preeminence. I make a comment within Phalaris's Bull. When someone dies, what do you know? That they will not return? To the end of all time? And how exactly do you know that? But you presume that and suffer. That type of presumption is the basis of all human suffering. One can develop that idea. Okay, I tend to write several modes of poetry, again, that intersect philosophy in a variety of ways. First, I write lyric poetry. And in fact, the first type of poetry, even before I wrote my kind of mature philosophical work, was lyric poetry, short poems. And these short poems, and poems are often seen as songs that convey a beauty, a wonder about the world. They're often seen as something that elevates us. I used lyric poetry to convey the tragic sense of life that my philosophical work would ultimately answer. So, let me give you some examples of how I use lyric poetry, again, to formulate the problems that philosophy will address, or that my philosophical work addresses and seeks to resolve. One early poem, and these are mostly early poems. I have written poems throughout my life, but I don't know. I like my early poems especially, so I'm going to recite a few of those. I did discern a caustic turn in fate's capricious play, a somber hue, a shadow's clue, as presaging dismay. Appeal was past the die once cast, no bartering away. No sleight of hand, no prayerful stand, no conjuring allay, with certainty of judgment, the ill verdict of decay. The tragic vision of things, right? The ill verdict of decay, the inevitability of decay, of disease, old age, and death, the Buddhist triad that Siddhartha, was directed all of his energies to freeing himself from, freeing humanity from. That tragic sense of life, the inevitability of darkness, of decay. The pain we suffer is of decay. Well, clearly, rigor is the only thing powerful enough to countervail us when we are addressing that extremity of despair, of commitment to what we presume about the course of events, the inevitable course of events, where, again, not inevitable from the perspective of rigor. One of my aphorisms that addresses that: we suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. But again, you see how the poem contains the tragic sense of life. Another example: I lean upon a moment, both in and out of time, as lucid as conception, as lyrical as rhyme, a lithe interpolation, reflected as refrain, upon the stillborn waters of immemorial pain. It has a beauty to it, a musical quality. That's one of the reasons why I feel it's appropriate to express the tragic vision of things within the lyric. I like that concatenation, that convergence of disparate aspects. The beauty of the sound with the despair of the vision. Well, that's a Buddhistic type poem. The notion that the waters of suffering are all around us. And that awareness of the pervasiveness of suffering. That's the first noble truth of Buddhism. Life is dukkha, is awry, sorrowful, suffering, wrong. It's where the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition begins. The fall from grace in Eden, the fall from a perfect world free of suffering. Well, again, philosophy answers the presumptions that support that view. Philosophical rigor does so. And another example, a little bit less kind of maybe religious in the sense that, that previous poem has a Buddhistic type of vision. Poem with a more, has a more personal aspect to it, but also situated within the tragic view of life. That, again, philosophy, my philosophical work, ultimately is answering, right? Rigor, not me, not the philosophy, rigor. Say my name to me, belatedly, in this the cool cellophane night, the splintering plexiglass night. To complement transparency, an after-image of canceli in milkweed whispers wistfully, say my name to me tonight. The idea that within a heuristic space, a convergent space, that's a societal space, a linguistic space, that's the space in which we see familiar objects. That's the space in which we suffer, that heuristic space. That is not the epistemic space of rigorous representation. That's not the divergent space. That's not that space, the epistemic space in which concepts do not arise at all, including the concepts of disease, old age, and death. But within that heuristic space, that convergent space, within that societal space, that technological space, what do we seek? What is our comfort? We find comfort in convergence. And so we find comfort in fraternity, in the presence of others, in love, which is a convergent experience. But a convergent experience, therefore, an experience playing itself out within the heuristic, within the presumptive, within the approximate, not within the rigorous. And again, it's our presumptions that support our pain and that ultimately motivate us to seek convergences that don't quite achieve a definitive solution. There's another set of aphorisms. Belief builds boats. They comfort us. They provide responses within a heuristic space, on heuristic seas, that take us to what we imagine to be safe harbors. Philosophy drains seas, eliminates the fundamental source of the pain in our premature assessments, our misrepresentations of the actual reality that we fail to see. We fail to see because survival is advanced by our seeking and finding patterns within experience. But those patterns are approximations, right? Any two sets of experiences are only approximately the same for some purpose. Rigor attends to the exactness of the distinction between them. That becomes the basis for the deconceptualization of our space and for the achievement of a solution that is stronger than what belief or what convergence or what fraternity, what the presence of others even can achieve. And we find that within Buddhism, right? Fare lonely as rhinoceros. From the standpoint of ultimate Buddhist enlightenment, nirvana, salvation, it's not others. It's the nature of the truth that is ultimately powerful and definitively redemptive, resolving of all the issues, dissipating of all the issues, all the concerns, all the anxieties, all the fears, all the suffering, all the pain. That's obviously the extremity of religious response. But again, as I've been emphasizing, the limit of rigor is extreme. And even though it's not a matter of belief, it's not a matter of faith, if it were, I wouldn't be delivering these talks. I'm not offering a contending point of view, offering an elaboration of the conditions, the nature of rigor itself that is, by definition, incontrovertible. Just a matter of understanding it. Okay. Other poets, many poets, have dealt with, have elaborated either aspects of the tragic sense of life, inevitably, because most poets tend to be living this world. They tend not to be living a rigorous epistemic space, right? That's a difficult thing to achieve. But I wanted to give a few examples, and especially of poets that I admire. Oh, and let me show you some images. I'm probably being remiss here. I always have images, and I'm not always showing them. So here, okay, so here's actually, hold on. For some reason, I lost that. Okay, here's an image. I don't know if I've ever shown that before. It might be a little bit hard to see. This is the cover of the books of Joshua. You see there's an artwork. That's one of my works. It's not a pole work. It's a flat acrylic piece of a different character than what you tend to see behind me. That's the books of Joshua. There is Plato. I mentioned him as being a philosopher who brought a poetic spirit, poetic vision, a poetic sensibility to the subject. That is Plato painted by Raphael in his great fresco in Athens, in the Vatican, the School of Athens, it's called. Let me see a couple of others. I've mentioned Phalaris's bull repeatedly. That's the, oh God, it's hard to see. It's kind of an abstract work. There's a bull that it's kind of an optical, it gives an optical effect, but it's very hard to see that, I'm afraid. That's the cover of the play itself, and that was used as the poster of the play in New York. Okay. One poet that was attuned to the challenges, the tragic aspect of life. In fact, she's been described as a poet who represents the sensibility of a consciousness trapped in time, is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson, this is the one photograph we have of her. That is actually how she looked. It's a daguerreotype, but it's effectively an early photograph. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you look her up online, you will see that image repeatedly of Emily Dickinson. For me, the greatest of all American poets, for me, as great a poet as has written in any language. She also wrote lyric poetry, and her poetry has, one can say, a tragic dimension to it. She is seeking resolution to circumstances, human circumstances that are fundamentally perceived as challenging, as unsatisfactory in some way, where ultimately a Christian resolution will address these types of concerns, at least in her belief, in her faith, in her hope. Here's a poem of hers. While we were fearing it, it came, but came with less of fear, because the fearing it so long had made it almost fair. There is a fitting, a dismay, a fitting, a despair. 'Tis harder knowing it is due than knowing it is here. The trying on the utmost, the morning it is new, is terribler than wearing it a whole existence through. Again, a lyric poet, a lyric poem. She wrote over 1,700 of them, with a sense of the unsatisfactoriness of life, and a sense of a response that's not quite complete, quite adequate to the challenge, that we fear something, but then once we have lived with it, we accommodate, at least to some degree. Now, obviously, that's not the type of complete and immediate resolution that Buddhism aspires to, that epistemic space attempts to represent, that mystical union with God within the Judeo-Christian tradition in different forms seeks to achieve. That notion of an immediate sense of God's presence, God's embrace, that completely and utterly resolves any element of anguish or pain or suffering. Right? So Emily Dickinson is providing a kind of psychological gloss, psychological response, right? That, just however bad or however much you might fear something, just trust that it's not ever going to be quite as bad. You will accommodate. But again, accommodation is not what philosophy at its limit is seeking. It wasn't what Buddhism was seeking. Here's another example, a poetic response to, again, the tragic sense of life. It's A.E. Housman, a late 19th, early 20th century British poet, another lyric poet. So his poetry is characterized by its music. He uses a very carefully controlled meter, a rhyme scheme. But again, he is as sensitive to the sound of the poems that he's writing as to their imagery, or their ideas. So again, a poet that I feel very much drawn to, as I feel drawn to Emily Dickinson's work, but drawn not partly for the ideas, but also significantly for the music that the poetry achieves. Here is A.E. Housman. And here's a poem. While we were fearing it, oh, that's Emily Dickinson, sorry. I to my perils of cheat and charmer came clad in armor by stars benign. Hope lies to mortals, and most believe her, but man's deceiver was never mine. The thoughts of others are light and fleeting, of lovers meeting, or luck or fame. Mine were of trouble, and mine were steady. So I was ready when trouble came. We like our ideas, we like to be armed against the challenges of experience, the challenges of time, the challenges of accident, the challenges of age, challenges of death, of dying. It's certainly what my philosophical work is meant to provide. I think I've given lots of examples of how the philosophy is designed to function like a switch to end whatever it is we are facing at the extremity of human circumstance. I've emphasized that during the earthquake, I had the experience of virtually dying, being buried alive in the earthquake, and thinking that I had reached the point of death, and invoking the philosophy and finding that it worked in the face of that extremity of challenge. In any situation where I've been challenged with physical pain, with acrophobia, with the death of my father, with the discovery of having been adopted, with whatever the challenge has been, I have invoked the philosophy like a switch. I've turned it on, and it has always worked. It has always ended whatever pain has been associated with that experience. Now, if it had failed at any time, at any point, again, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be discussing the philosophy, because I don't want to be perpetrating a fraud. I don't want to be communicating something that doesn't work for me, but maybe it'll work for somebody else. No, there's that famous admonition within medicine: physician, heal thyself. The first test is that my philosophical work works for me. And it always has. And it has in the way that a houseman was trying to arm himself against experience. But again, the only thing that I know of that is strong enough for all contingencies, all experiences, are the limit of rigor, because that is the incontrovertible. That is what cannot fail us by nature, by definition. Okay. Yes, let's see. I wanted to give a few more examples. Let me check here on something. 1 second. Okay, here's an example. Now, this I don't know by heart, but one of the things that poetry has been used for historically has been communicating moral philosophy. Again, responses to human life that don't quite rise to the level of the philosophically rigorous, don't quite rise often to the level of like the religious, though obviously poetry has been used in the service of religious expression, religious representation. But there's been a branch of philosophy, moral philosophy, which attempts to provide guidance and consolation, in the face of the challenges of life that, again, don't quite rise to the level of a definitive solution, but help us. They help us in some way, to some degree. And one of the purveyors of moral philosophy of that type, that in fact took often a poetic form, is Samuel Johnson, the English man of letters of the 18th century, considered the greatest of all English men of letters. He was a poet, a biographer, a literary critic, a moral philosopher. He wrote essays, giving guidance, to everyday life, everyday challenges. But again, within the context of an attempted response, not a rigorous or even a Buddhistic or even quite a fully realized Christian response, at least at the level of mystical Christianity, mystical union with God, that extremity, right? We're not talking about that level, but guidance. Here's an example, and it comes at the end of a famous poem of his called The Vanity of Human Wishes. It's in fact the very end of the poem, and the lines read, "Pour forth thy fervors for a healthful mind, obedient passions, and a will resigned, for love, which scarce collective man can fill, for patience, sovereign or transmuted ill, for faith, that panting for a happier seat counts death kind nature's signal of retreat. These goods for man the laws of heaven ordain. These goods he grants, who grants the power to gain. With these, celestial wisdom calms the mind and makes the happiness she does not find. We're looking for patience. It's a provisional solution, not a definitive solution. It's not the solution that I've been developing, that I've been articulating, that the great religious traditions at their extremity, at their limit, at their limit of, again, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, at their limit of mystical representation, or in the case of Buddhism, at the limit of its achievement representation of the nature of enlightenment, of the identification of samsara, the world of suffering here and now, with nirvana, the world of a complete resolution achieved here and now. So again, moral philosophy tends to be quite an order of magnitude less ambitious, right, than the type of rigorous philosophical representation that I've been, again, developing, and that we also find within religious traditions. Again, the difference is that philosophy is not grounded in belief or opinion or faith, but rigor. And we get the same type of moral address, moral advice, guidance in Shakespeare, often, periodically. One of his most famous is in Hamlet. Men must endure their going hence, even as they're coming hither. Ripeness is all, being prepared for the circumstance. But again, men must endure. Buddhism, at its limit, is not speaking about enduring. It's speaking about a complete and ecstatic resolution. Philosophy, at its limit, is not speaking about enduring. It's speaking about ending the presumptions upon which a notion of endurance is based, within which it is grounded. Okay? Well, now, we do actually wanted to make a few comments about the poet John Keats, who was philosophically attuned, especially in his letters, in his criticism. He wrote, for example, of negative capability, the ability to entertain ideas and allow them organically to achieve a coherent formulation, not rushing prematurely to a solution. Keats was a romantic poet, a poet who lived late 18th, early 19th century, a time of English Romanticism, European Romanticism. Now, when we talk about the Romantic, we typically think in terms of dimensions of love. Romanticism had a much broader sensibility. It was interested in, I gave a talk once on the sublime. Romanticism was in pursuit of the sublime, and how I define the sublime is that which is strange and beautiful and new, that which is epistemically present, that which is present in the novelty of each moment. The sublime would be overwhelming. Were we to experience it in its full intensity, would be experiencing the world as if for the very first time, with primal eyes. That's the intensity of the sublime. For the Romantic poet, it was something terrifying. It's unfamiliar, it's strange, it's new, but it's also operating at the limit of beauty. One of the important aspects of the Romantic that infuses both the poetry of the Romantics and philosophical dimensions of the Romantic aspiration that intersects my work, my thought, is the sense of the unbounded. When we talk about the past not guaranteeing the future deciding the past, we're emphasizing in particular that whatever sense we have of the past does not bound future experience. It does so scientifically. We use the past as a guide to the future, but rigorously it does not. Right? Rigor is achieving an absolute freedom, right? The truth shall make you free. The truth that shall make one free within philosophical understanding is that truth at the limit of rigor that frees us from the constraints, from the presumptions that are grounded in the past. So it is philosophy in its rigor establishes the unbounded. It's, in fact, boundaries that define objects. Boundaries are convergences. When we think of an elemental boundary, we think of that, two things coming together. That's a convergent process. When we think of something having an inside and an outside, we think of a bound. Objects are bounded. Another way to describe heuristic space, a convergent space, is a bounded space, or a space with bounded elements, objects, an objective space. A heuristic space, a convergent space, is an objective space. It's a space in which one sees objects because it's defined by convergences that present as boundaries. Okay? Well, what establishes the unbounded, the essentially romantic? Philosophy in its rigor, because epistemic space is divergent, by nature unbounded. Here's how I represent it in Phalaris's Bull. The romantic is the unbounded, young summers and sunsets and oceans and evenings and longings and fulfillments extending forever. Philosophy establishes the unbounded, incontrovertibly, a truth more than beauty, pure and true romance. It's the romance of the poetic at its highest embodiment. It's also the romance of philosophy. It's another aspect, another dimension to the poetry of philosophy, that it can inspire us in that way, achieve that emotional fulfillment, release, representation. We have some time. I know I have a lot of questions to get to. There are a few more things I wanted to address quickly. Okay. Within writings that I admire, the work of Shakespeare in particular, the work of T.S. Eliot, an American poet of the late 19th, early 20th century, who actually expatriated to England, lived out his life there, but was American, one of the great modern poets, a Nobel Prize winner for literature. You see philosophical tendencies being given a more full poetic representation at a higher level within their work. And there are two famous examples I wanted to read or recite. One, we talked last time about how the philosophical enterprise, certainly in the view of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, those two great 19th century philosophers, begins with the ability to see life, at least occasionally, as dream. That's one way in which Buddhism can be represented. Life is dream, not the onerous, burdensome reality that we think is enchaining us. I have an aphorism, though. To see life as dream is the starting point of philosophy and the halfway point back to Eden. It's not the solution. It's not the end. But within Shakespeare, that really is maybe the highest level of philosophical formulation that we encounter. I have enormous respect for Shakespeare, but Shakespeare wasn't quite a philosopher. He's a dramatist and a poet. He does give powerful voice to the notion of life as dream and its somewhat ecstatic aspect. This is from his final play that we have, The Tempest. You do look, my son, of a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, cloud-capped towers, solemn temples, the gorgeous palaces, the great globe itself shall dissolve. And like an insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Again, that is a philosophical, poetic representation, but life as dream, not, though, to my mind, a complete and satisfactory philosophical resolution. A complete and satisfactory resolution ends all concepts, including that of dream. Again, the beginning point, seeing life as dream, is the starting point of philosophy, the halfway point back to Eden, not there, not at the full limit and realization of the implications of a rigorous account. And finally, T.S. Eliot, at the end of Four Quartets, a philosophical work. He had actually, as a young man, studied philosophy at Harvard, at the Sorbonne, but he was studying sort of late 19th century English European philosophy. Philosophy advanced substantially, in the years after T.S. Eliot was studying it. But a fairly compelling philosophical expression at the end of Four Quartets, his great work, The Four Quartets. Quick now, here, now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. Now, Eliot there lays out the condition of a complete and rigorous response. Here, now, always. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. But he himself, within his work, doesn't quite formulate it, doesn't rise to the level of that formulation. And what is the level of that formulation? There, right? But again, the notion that the epistemic provides a solution right here, right now, and independent of all possible future experience. And that notion of a condition of complete simplicity, again, two things are not equal to one, two is not equal to one. That's as simple a formulation as one can have, and that is actually a complete expression, a complete formulation of the conditions of a solution, a definitive solution, here and now, because that's a way of representing the nature of rigor, right? Rigor is of difference. All teach you differences, wrote Shakespeare. Okay, I think I will close. I was going to recite a little bit of Joshua, but we're out of time for that. So I'm going to close with a short aphoristic book that represents, again, a convergence of the poetic and the aphoristic. Now, this is a difficult book these books are difficult to hear. I've written a couple of hundred of them. They're difficult to understand, but without studying, the words, the constructions, because the poetry is concentrated and the aphoristic writing is concentrated. So it's doubly concentrated, but it's the sound that helps communicate the meaning. And I just wanted to give you an exposure, again, to another instance of that sound, the poetic dimension of certainly my philosophical writing and of philosophy at, I think, its highest, right? Its highest aspiration. A little bit of rigor, but again, poetically expressed. Now, I also illustrate these aphoristic poetic representations where each panel, it's a little bit hard to see, but that is a representation where each panel represents one aphorism or a portion of an aphorism. It's a graphic work that you can see on my website, thebooksofjoshua.com. That's where this can be seen in its full detail. But let me read it to you again, just to give you a sense of the convergence of the poetic and the philosophic in an aphoristic form. And it goes like this. And the book is called Land of Glowing Sand, Close at Hand. So there's rhythms, and there is rhyme, and there is aphoristic philosophic representation. 1. The undertow will know. Philosophy sees certainty. Technology boasts tolerance to duplicity. Salvation grows precise in singularity. Science plays heuristic to reality's epistemic. We die in worlds not our own. We live beyond our means in futures to the bone. Repetition guides decision to illusion. Battering rams cheat delusion. We cannot draw to natural law. One only sings individual things. Solutions slice strings of rings. With blades a sharper rigor brings, from which existence springs. So that is one form in which I write philosophy poetically. That represents, again, the convergence of the aphoristic and the poetic, where rhythm and rhyme contribute to the meaning and the communication of the work. Okay, we have some time, not a lot of time, but maybe enough time for questions. There were 4 questions from last time that I want to address. Now, some of these are broad questions that I could almost devote an entire talk to, and maybe I will, for some of these. But let me at least give you a little gloss on some of these. 1, what is your attitude towards the generality and specifics in everyday life? Well, okay, for one thing, for me, it's everywhere, right? I am constantly emphasizing the importance of being attuned to the novelty of circumstance, the specificity of our condition. We exist by virtue of the specificity of our condition. And the specificity of our condition is our salvation, because whatever distinguishes us from anything else means that what applies to anything else does not rigorously apply to us. That is the condition of freedom, and I am always in mind of that. In terms of generality, there are 2 modes of generality that I encounter. One is the generality of that representation of a solution, namely that rigor is of difference and we exist in difference from everything else. That is actually a general formulation of the nature of our circumstance and the solution to our circumstance. At a lower level of generality, well, we see what? We see pattern. We see associations. We operate within linguistic space. So at the highest level of generality, we get the philosophic formulations like the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, that frees us from circumstance, frees us from the burden of circumstance, from the burden of the past. But at a lower level of generality, well, we have science, we have pattern, we have anticipations based upon past experience, where we are generalizing based upon approximate similarities, family resemblances, degrees of similarity, degrees of generality, but not its full limit. Okay, I know these are short. I'm dealing with them quickly because, again, I spoke too long. But how can we see that from a philosophical perspective with no professional degree? Okay, when I first started giving talks, almost 20 years ago now, what I noticed was that there were people that were attending the talks with no philosophical background, no academic background, people that didn't even go to college, that would variously shake, would have almost like an emotional, religious experience in the course of the talk because they just happened to understand, happened to engage with something. That is the point of the aphorisms, that maybe one of these aphorisms, maybe one thing I say, will trigger, that type of understanding that illuminates the whole. Maybe it's as that aphorism that Cindy, was transformed by. We suffer because we think the past is fixed and controls the future. The reality is the opposite. The past is not fixed, and the future decides it. Or an aphorism like blues, greens, aquamarines. Who could have imagined? Or maybe it's the sound. Or maybe it's just, that in one of these talks, something will trigger. But my experience has been that people are able to respond eventually, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, independent of any philosophical background or exposure. And I often find that some of the people that have the most difficulty are professors of philosophy, because they have a set of presuppositions about the nature of the subject that my work is actually challenging. So if I hadn't found that people without a philosophical background were able to understand, respond, variously, I wouldn't, again, be giving the talks. And that's one of the points of today's talk, that the sound can communicate some of the meaning and the emotionality of the meaning. Okay, what kind of functions of philosophy are important in the modern world? Obviously, for me, everything. Philosophy at the limit of rigor is the one place of definitive guidance, definitive representation of our circumstance, of the nature of existence. It's able to clarify everything, including everything that is operating at a lower level. So it can, for example, clarify the nature of science, because science is not operating rigorously. But in the same way, it's able to marshal an understanding of, by understanding epistemic space, understanding what's not epistemic, namely heuristic, and how that operates in terms of convergences. And again, that has practical implications for the address of every conceivable type of problem. I used it to develop those cancer results some years ago. We'll talk about that maybe next week, actually, because I might be giving a talk next week on the philosophy of health. It's International Health Day. And let's see, one more question. Which methodology of teaching do you recommend? I don't know if we're talking here, if the question is about teaching in general, teaching philosophy. When we're talking about teaching, to put it in a broader philosophical context, we're talking about the achievement of a goal, right? Communicating, achieving, understanding, mastery of a subject, perhaps. Whenever we're dealing with achieving a goal, we're working towards a goal, we're operating within heuristic space, we're operating convergently. So teaching always is a matter of, for me, diverse approaches, diverse and manifold approaches. That can mean repetition, or it could mean various avenues of approach. I've told the story in the past of how when I was taking a Wittgenstein course at Harvard, the professor was asked, well, if we have time to read the philosophical investigations, the major work we were studying, should we also read Wittgenstein's Blue and Brown books? And the professor said, if you have time to read the investigations and the Blue and Brown books, read the investigations twice. If you have time to read the investigations twice and the Blue and Brown books, read it 3 times. I ended up reading the investigations 6 times in that course. That's the basis of my understanding, of my assimilation of the work of Wittgenstein. So repetition is not the definition of insanity, it is the means of mastery. And I emphasize that in all of my teaching. And also that there's not one approach to anything, not one solution to any type of problem. There are always diverse approaches, but convergence is the key to any kind of mastery. So approaching things repeatedly and from different directions. Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. So again, I spoke too long during my main talk, but I hope it was illuminating. And again, since we were talking about poetry and the sound and the music and its aspiration, I hope it was inspiring. Philosophy is meant to be comforting and inspiring, and the music of it can help achieve those results.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for the talks. And as always, it was very entertaining. You covered so many aspects. And we do have feedbacks. We do have the thumbs up. Thank you, guys. We see that all. Also, we do have Yerkan. He joins us weekly. Thank you very much, Yerkan. He says, "Good morning, Professor." Then the same comment from Yerkan. "I'm very glad to see you."
Thank
Then
you.
goes the question. We're just going to read it out and address next week. Yerkan, why happened World War from philosophical explanation?
Good question. That will be something I will be eagerly addressing next time. Yes.
Yerkan, again, I'm sorry, just a second, Yerkan. Most analytics said this crisis is of human and spiritual, and my question: role of modern philosophy solving the problems.
I will address that.
Hello from Myanmar. Hello, Min P. And then the last comment is from Yerkan. "Thank you very much for interesting lectures, Professor Stephen Friedman." So one more time, we would like to give big thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Stephen, thank you very much. Have a great week and see you all. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.